Okay, good day everyone. Kim here. Welcome back to Ephesians. We're in Ephesians chapter 2 and I'm in the middle of verse 2 at the moment. For quite a few weeks now, we've been looking at the way in which God has blessed us so thoroughly and absolutely in union with his son Jesus. And we've looked at the way in which that blessing has just been poured out immensely richly. And we've then gone on to talk about the way in which Paul is praying for the Ephesians that that their hearts and their own spirit will be a spirit of wisdom and revelation, and their hearts will just know God better and know the hope of God's calling on them. Now, the hope of God's calling, as I've said before, is if you read through Ephesians chapter 1, it is all full of the call that God puts on a person's life as he calls them, and you respond by trusting in Jesus, and the Lord just blesses us with our union with Jesus, and everything that God gives us is in union with his son, and then he goes on to describe how the power that God has for us is in keeping with the fact that Jesus has been raised up into a position of authority that is far above every authority that exists in this world and will ever in fact exist, both spiritual authorities and earthly human authorities. Jesus is above all of them, and they've all been subjected to him. So you have this picture of Jesus who has got immense authority, and he's been given to the church. And then it goes on at the end of chapter 1, it talks about the way in which that the church is his body, and it is the fullness of him who fills all in all. And so we've got this huge picture of what the church actually is, that we're not to just skip over, because the actual authority and the power of Jesus ends up working through the church as each part operates in relation to the other, as each member of Jesus's body serves each other. The power of God is at work, but also as the church operates out in the world. If we'll only get hold of that, the fact that we have the fullness of God through being joined with Jesus, and we express the fullness of God. So that's a lovely picture. But as I've mentioned already in the previous video, Paul then switches and changes gear to something really different. And he basically goes back and reminds the church about where they once were, and then he goes on to describe where they are now in terms of what God has done. But we're in the middle still of sort of a really quite serious section. He's just talked about at the beginning of verse 2, he says, in verse 1 and into verse 2, he says, "And you were dead in your trespasses and sins, in which you formerly walked, according to the course of this world." And we looked at that last session. The fact that the world has got a certain pattern, it's got a certain way, and that we used to walk in keeping with that pattern. We conform to it. I don't know, I can't remember if in my last video if I pointed out the fact that Paul sometimes talks about being about that we were in something, and sometimes he talks about us living according to something. And the in stuff, where he says that we're in trespasses and sin, it means that we're absolutely immersed in it, unavoidably immersed. But when he talks according to, he's talking more in keeping with, in this immersion that we're in this, we were in a whole way of living that was in keeping with transgressions and sins. He then goes on to say that we lived according to the way of the world, which suggests that there is a certain pattern or course that the world takes, and we basically conform to it. We basically came under it. We submitted to it. We sort of ran with it. But now, halfway through verse 2, he goes on to talk to another according to, that we used to live according to the prince of the power of the air, of the spirit that is now working in the sons of disobedience. That's how Paul describes it. Now, again, this is a conforming to thing. And it's basically, this time, it isn't just conforming to a pattern, but it's conforming to an actual being. And this being is described as the prince of the power of the air. That word prince is really a word, it could be, I think, probably better described as a ruler of some kind. And in fact, the Greek word is arche, and it's the first of the power of the air. In John chapter 15, I think it is, at the end of John chapter 14, Jesus refers to this particular being, this spirit, and he describes him as the ruler of this world. And it's the idea that in this world there is a spiritual being who is actually in operation and who actually is working with significant authority in such a way that you could describe it as the ruler of the world, or the ruler of the power of the air. In the same way that we might describe the Prime Minister as the Prime Minister of Australia, we might think of this particular spiritual authority as having huge influence in this world. Now, it says that we all walked according to the prince of the power of the air. The power of the air is an unusual expression, and there is some debate about what it actually means. I think there are two ideas that are quite significant that I think can stand when we look at this verse. One is the idea that when they actually saw spiritual powers influencing people, if you've ever seen, there are probably videos online about this, where objects are shifted, where people are affected by a spirit of some kind, and you suddenly find that they are actually controlled in some way, almost as if they're being moved and manipulated. But when you ask the question, what are you being moved and manipulated by? All there is air around you. That's what it seems like. And so we find that the air is the place, the air around us, in this, that these invisible beings actually operate. Jesus, the accounts are in the New Testament where for instance, somebody who was demonized, in other words, influenced by a demon, would be thrown into a fire or thrown down or affected in some very physical way out of their control. And from the perspective of somebody viewing it, they would have said, there's something here, but I can't see it. It's just in the air that is at work powerfully in this person's life. Now, that's one way of understanding this ruler of the power of the air. The second way is to think about the air around us as the lowest part of the heavenly realms. In the Jewish way of thinking about the heavenly realm was to sort of say, look up. And there was the earthly realm, and there was the heavenly realm, and even the realm of the atmosphere and the clouds and the heavens, if you like. The heavens, the word the heavens sometimes described the clouds and the sun and the stars and those sorts of things, and the wind and all that stuff up there. So it was considered to be a lower level of the heavens, because the Jews thought in terms of there being different levels of the heavenly realms, and that in the highest heavenly realms, God was ruling from there. And so that was the significant place of authority. And we've already seen a reference to that earlier in Ephesians, where we're told that we've been blessed in the heavenly realms, or in the heavenlies, with every spiritual blessing in Christ Jesus. And so we find that these heavenly realms were the places where spiritual forces were at work and authorities existed, but they were also a place where the throne of God was, where the ultimate authority was in operation. We found earlier in Ephesians that Christ is seated at the right hand of God in the heavenly realms, in the highest place. So this world, in terms of the atmosphere and the realm that we can see, the wind blows, the clouds and all that, in this realm, this realm connected to the earth, this ruler, this particular ruler, or this first, if you like, the first among the many demonic powers, is actually in operation and has authority. So we've got that picture here at work. Now, I mentioned the idea of being demonized. Often when we think about demonic beings or Satan operating, thoughts conjure up, pictures conjure up, maybe a movie we saw on television, which are usually just completely wrong. Normally, we often think about the work of demons as in terms of being possessed by a demon or something like that. The scriptures don't talk about demon possession. they talk, the word that's used is actually the idea of simply being demonized. In other words, influenced by a demon. So a person can be influenced by a demon in lots of different ways. Sometimes it's in such a way that the person is completely controlled, and whether we like it or not, there are instances of that, definitely, that happen in the world. But you can be influenced by demons in all sorts of ways, and you can be influenced by demons by believing what they teach, or things they've said. You can believe their lies. You can believe the scriptures talk about doctrines of demons, in other words, teachings that actually have their source in demonic powers. Here we find that the significant thing about the rule of Satan in this is that he is at work in what is called the sons of disobedience. And basically he's saying that people who have not submitted themselves to Jesus, have not been open to the gospel and have responded to Christ, are considered to be the sons of disobedience. Now, it's a strange expression. The idea of being sons of something is that you basically have the characteristics of that somebody. We understand this when we think of fathers and sons, or fathers and children, or parents and children. We understand that the children and the sons and the daughters end up having characteristics that come from the parents. And as someone who teaches in schools, you sometimes see that you look at the behaviour of the kids, and then you meet the parents and you go, oh, I get that. I understand why the kids are like that, because they're like their parents, and that can work in good ways and not so good ways. So what we understand, the idea of sons of disobedience, is the idea that the sons of disobedience take on the characteristics of the parent, and the parent is disobedience, and the disobedience is something that is found in this power, this authority of the power of the air. Satan is described as the father of lies, and that lies are its native language. The native language, the natural language of Satan is simply to lie, to not speak the truth, or to use the truth in such a way that it's used deceptively. That's what the enemy does. But in this case, we've got the significant characteristic of this prince of the power of the air is that it is a disobedient spirit. Now, and as a result, those it influences are also disobedient. The word disobedient there has behind it the idea of stubbornness. This idea of stubborn disobedience, a resistance to God. And that is the characteristic nature of people who are not walking with God, is that their will is stubbornly opposed. And as a result, their thinking is shaped by their will, and they take on board ideas and give ground to feelings and desires and stuff that are opposed to the actual will of God. So here we have it, that there is this ruler of the power of the air that has been at work and is at work in the sons of disobedience, and we used to work in exactly that way. Now, if we've thought about our pre-Christian life in such a way as that we thought, oh, actually, we thought of it as having nothing to do with spirits and being under the authority of spirits and influenced by spirits, we need to change our mind and actually understand that that was the state that we were actually in. If we understand that, then we'll also understand what we turn away from and turn to. We turn away from coming under the influence of demonic powers and satanic powers, and we actually turn to the authority of Jesus. In Colossians, it actually says that God has transferred us away from the authority of darkness into the kingdom of the Son that he loves. And so we understand there has been a shift of authority that has occurred. But, you know, the significant thing he says in accordance with this is that he then goes on to say in verse 3, among them we too all formerly lived. Now, the Greek basically says, in them we too all formerly lived. And he's reminding us that if we think that we were somehow more special or better in any way than other people who haven't come to the Lord yet, the answer is no way. You are exactly the same. In fact, you used to live in that. Note the in there. Some Bibles will say among. It's actually in them we too all formerly lived. Now that word lived isn't actually the word for lived. It's the idea of being back there. It's a little bit like if somebody tells you a story about their childhood, and the person says, and they recount the event or the time period, and you go, oh, when you said that, I felt like I was back there. In other words, as if I was living back there when you described it. Well, the word is actually the idea of being back there. You were back there too. That's how you in fact lived. That's how you operated. That's what you were under. That's what Paul is described, and this is a full-on picture. He goes on, and I'm going to shift from looking at the New American Standard Bible, and I'm going to look more at how the Greek kind of presents it. I'm not going to look at Greek words, but I want to look at the Greek structure, because he says, in them we too all formerly lived. We were back there. And then he says, in the lusts of our flesh. Now, again, note there, it's in something. We were immersed in something. In the lusts of our flesh. Now that word lust, it has to do with a fierce passion. It's not just an emotional desire of some kind, but it's actually got to do with a fierce passion. And then he says, we lived in the fierce passions of our flesh. Now, our flesh is basically the human condition back then, separated from God, separated from the Holy Spirit, separate from Christ, actually simply just operating out of and being rolled constantly by the power of sin in our lives. And we find that our flesh ended up having desires, and sin in us actually would have us falling into line with those desires all the time. And the desires were passionate, fierce desires. Now, and then it goes on in verse 3, and it says, and the NASB talks about indulging the desires of the flesh. It's actually the idea, the word is actually, and making, and performing, or executing, putting it into practice, flesh's will. That's how it describes it. And it's not so much simply that flesh had desires, but in other words, had feelings, because often when we think about desire, we think about feelings. But it's the idea that we were executing, putting into play, flesh's desire in terms of, I want something, I want it. So it's the idea of thinking about desire in terms of willfully wanting something, purposefully wanting something. That's the idea of the Greek word. So what we were how we characteristically lived, and the way we were living was one of performing and making flesh's desires and will, and flesh's thoughts. Now, the idea of thoughts isn't just the idea of a stray thought or an idea. It's the idea of the actual understanding. It's a more comprehensive mode of thinking, if you like. It's what we finally come to. That's the idea. So it's not just a random thought coming out of our flesh, but it's all the conclusions that we come to and the mindsets that we end up entering into. Now, you find this idea in Ephesians 4:17 and 18, where Paul says, so this I say and affirm together with the Lord, that you walk no longer just as the Gentiles also walk, in the futility of their mind. That word futility is kind of an empty fruitlessness, emptiness. It says, verse 18, being darkened in their understanding, excluded from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them, because of the hardness of their heart. And they, having become callous, have given themselves over to sensuality for the practice of every kind of impurity with greediness. That is an awful picture of people. And it tells you something about this will and desire of the flesh that we were under, and the thinking that flowed out of that fleshly will. And then it goes on to say, and were by nature children of wrath. Now that word nature is essence. In other words, we were essentially children of wrath. Now, again, the idea of children of wrath is similar to sons of disobedience. And it's the idea that as children, we took on the likeness of that which fathered us. And it's the idea of that wrath has fathered us. Now, that word wrath, sometimes we think about it simply as anger, and we take on board the idea that wrath is like human anger, because human anger just comes out in outbursts, and it's often irrational and emotional, and often badly judged, and lacks control and lacks measure. But you know, the wrath of God is probably, it can be interpreted as anger, but it is anger in the way that God expresses it. You see, when God expresses anger, it is with self-control, and it is measured, and he doesn't flip his lid or anything like that, the way that human beings do, and I know certainly I have done before. But God isn't like that. God's anger has to do with an anger toward sin in the world and the way we express it. And what God does is you often find that when the scriptures talk about, particularly in the New Testament, but not exclusively in the New Testament, when God expresses his wrath towards sin, what you find so often is that he expresses that anger by actually handing people over to the decisions and the will that they are making. And you find this in Romans chapter 1, where God hands people over to their decisions and their commitments. People decide not to value God, not to consider God's glory as being valuable, and so he hands them over to the things that they choose instead. And their lives just get worse and worse as they commit themselves to their particular way. And when God does that, he doesn't do it so as to say, oh, I'm just going to hand you over and that's the end of you. He does it in order that people will be free to actually make their bad choices and then come to a place, hopefully at some point, where they go, life is terrible. I really need God. You see, that's the nature of the wrath of God. He doesn't control you. What he does is he hands you over to your decisions. If you won't change your mind freely, he gives you the freedom to actually choose your will and your destination, and then he comes for you afterwards, and then he waits until you're at another place where things have got worse, because inevitably that's what it's like. If you turn away from God and if you choose your own way, at some point in time you will find yourself with your face in the mud. And you know, so often in life where the wrath of God is poured out in our lives and he hands us over to the things we've chosen, and we'll find ourselves flat on our face, and then we pick ourselves up and then just keep going in the same direction. And you know, sometimes we are open to God at that point and life has got terrible, and we actually go, oh God, help me, because I've really stuffed it now. And I hope that you've come to that place in your life, or are coming to that place in your life, because I'll tell you, the bad things that happen in our lives, sometimes we think they're just dreadful, but sometimes they are God's opportunity to actually bring us to a place of humility before him, where we'll actually stop going on in our stubborn way and we'll turn back to him. So this is the terrible picture that Paul paints, and he's not over-dramatizing. And he's not saying all this just to make us feel bad or anything like that. What he's trying to do is to give us a realistic picture of where in fact we were. Because if we haven't got that picture of where we were, we will not really take hold of the gospel of Jesus properly. And I'll tell you why. This is important. Paul has basically given us a picture of ourselves that has got nothing redeemable in it. There is no redeemable feature. There is no feature of our lives where you could look at it and go, hey, that was actually quite good. That's something that God can build on. We can take that bit with us into this new life with God. And God is saying, no. The work I need to do in you is a work where everything has to go. All the things that you've built need to go. The foundations need to be completely ripped up because they are rotten. And this is what we need to understand about how God looks at the kind of life we used to live and the kind of capacity we used to have and the kind of wisdom we thought we had. And he says the whole lot has to go because I'm going to actually lay down a completely new foundation. And this new foundation is actually in the message of the gospel of Jesus, the good news of Jesus. You see, Paul later on in chapter 2, he goes on to talk about the fact that a new foundation has been laid. And this foundation is the foundation of the apostles and the prophets. And the foundation of the apostles and prophets is the message of Jesus. Now, the message of the grace and the provision of Jesus is the foundational thing in our life now. There is no other foundation that God has provided for us. We are not to build on what we had before. That thing that we had before actually had to go with Jesus to the cross and needed to die and needed to be buried dead. And that is in fact one of the significant things about the cross, the fact that the death of Jesus was one in which we were included, and our old life actually went to its death. Nothing was kept above water, if you like. Nothing was kept safe, if you like, in order to have it be part of the new life. The whole lot had to go and die and be put to death. And what we find now is there's a new foundation in our life, and it is basically the good news of Jesus. Jesus is our new foundation. Jesus is our life now. Jesus is our treasure now. Jesus is our wisdom now. Jesus is our knowledge now. And Jesus is the foundation of everything in our new life. Now, having said that, we need to understand that so often in our life, the Spirit of God is bringing us conviction about things in our life. And this conviction can sometimes be painful because He's actually unearthing something that we've relied upon in our previous life, that previous time before we had actually become Christians. And we've got a pattern in our life that He's actually undermining and trying to expose in order that we will not rely upon it any longer, and instead put our full confidence on the foundation that is Jesus, and that we would only build on that. That is so important. And guys, I guess what Paul is saying is give up on yourself. Give up on yourself. God is not building something based on who you were. He is building something based on His Son, Jesus Christ, and your union with Him and our union with Him. And together as a community, the church, our whole understanding of the church, the other people who have been called to Jesus, is that we would see them too, as being founded afresh on the foundation of Jesus. Okay, I hope the Spirit of God brings that home to you. I'd better stop there or we'll be going for too long. I hope this is good news, because Paul is about to talk about what God has done. But I wanted us to see first that Paul has ripped out he's knocked down the building of our lives and said, that's gone, that's gone, that's gone. Your whole foundation is gone now. New foundation time. And we're about to look at some of that new foundation in the next verse. Bless you in Jesus' name.